Welcome back in. Today we're discussing our week one wide receiver rankings and must start players for this week. Let's go ahead and get right to it. We're going to start with our wide receiver ones, and they are as follows. Surprise, surprise, Jamar Chase leads things off. Then it's Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Neighbors, Nico Collins, AJ Brown, Brian Thomas Jr., Amon-Ra St. Brown, Drake London, Puka Nacua, Mike Evans, and Lad McConkey wrap out our top 12. So let's go ahead and talk about a few of these situations. I don't need to get into as much with these guys because let's face it, you drafted these guys extremely high. You're starting them this week. But I do want to hit on a few situations here that I do really like. And the first one is going to be AJ Brown going up against the Cowboys. Now, the Eagles have the highest implied team total of the week and are tied with the Broncos with the largest spread of 7.5 points in their Thursday night matchup. Now, last season, the Eagles threw the ball at the lowest rate in the league. Now, a crazy stat here from Lord Reeves was A.J. Brown was only targeted 35 times in the second half of games because the Eagles rarely trailed. It didn't really need to open up the offense. A.J. Brown last year averaged 7.5 targets per game and had the 10th highest target per out run rate last year, and he finished wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game. Efficiency-wise, he is still an absolute baller. He finished second in yards per out run, fourth in yards per target, and first in yards per team pass attempt. A.J. Brown has been an efficiency monster in his entire career. He does more with less. And if he was targeted the same way Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, I think he would be right there in the conversation as the wide receiver one. Now, as far as this first matchup is concerned, they get a terrific matchup against the Cowboys, who just traded away Micah Parsons to the Packers. Now, last season, the Cowboys struggled to limit opposing wide receivers as they allowed the sixth most receiving yards and touchdowns to wide receivers. So this is a very good matchup here for the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, we do have a different offensive coordinator here with this team as Kellen Moore moved on to the Saints. So I think this team is going to throw the ball a lot more this season. I love both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith this week. I think both of them are top 24 wide receivers this week. So let's keep moving here and talk about one of my favorite game environments of the entire week, first week of games, and that is going to be Drake London going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, London, as we know, is an absolute target hog. He had 157 targets. He had 30% target per out run rate last year, which was top 3 among all wide receivers. He also finished top 3 in red zone targets, but was extremely poor quarterback play with Kirk Cousins, how terrible he was with the first half of the season. It limited his ceiling a little bit as he finished wide receiver 13 in fantasy points per game, but he checks all the boxes from the efficiency standpoint, and the situation hasn't really changed heading into 2025 with the same supporting cast. But Darnell Mooney is dealing with an injury, but he did return to practice this past Thursday, opening the door for him to play. But no matter what, this is a very consolidated target share. Yes, Kyle Pitts is still there, but Kyle Pitts has never really been a thing. And so with Michael Penix in year 2 here, I think Drake London is going to continue to see a very, very heavy target share. And this is a phenomenal matchup. The Bucs last season allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And let's not forget the last season when these two teams played in their 2 games last year, they were absolutely nuclear, combining for 57 and 66 combined points in those 2 games. So I think the environment is there for this to be a very similar type of game environment. So I really want to start as many wide receivers as I can from this game that I have. So Drake London is definitely a lock for me. Mike Evans, next up, is I'm going to talk about on the other side of the ball. And he continues to be really one of the most underrated wide receivers in the league. He has now put up back-to-back seasons of being a top 10 fantasy producer in fantasy points per game. Yet he keeps getting drafted like he's just a wide receiver too. Last season, Evans averaged 7.9 targets with a 26.8% target per out run rate last year. He's also the go-to target inside the red zone for Baker. Continues to be efficient at 32 years old. He finished 13th in yards per route run and 14th in yards per team pass attempt. Evans' situation initially looked crowded after they signed Chris Godwin to a new contract and drafted Emeka Egbuka. However, his situation has changed dramatically. Chris Godwin had a setback in his injury rehab, and now looks like he's going to roughly miss the first 4 weeks of the season. And then you have Jaylen McMillan, who exploded down the stretch last year. He suffered a neck injury. He's going to miss 8 to 10 weeks. So at first, a situation looked crowded. Now looks absolutely extremely consolidated here for week 1. And, I think you're going to see Mike Evans shoulder the load here and get an incredible matchup against the Falcons, who allowed the 3rd most PPR points to the position last year. And the only game that he played against the Falcons last year had 5 catches, 60-plus yards, and 2 touchdowns. I really like this spot here for Mike Evans this week. Next up, let's move over to our wide receiver 2s here. And they are as follows. It's going to be T. Higgins, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, Tet McMillan, Xavier Worthy, Ricky Pearsall, Marvin Harrison Jr., Terry McLaurin, Devonta Smith, and DJ Moore. So let's talk about some of these wide receiver 2 here. First, I'm going to talk about is T. Higgins. In 12 games last year, T. Higgins averaged 9.1 targets per game and was Burrow's security blanket in the red zone, seeing 24 targets, which was top 5 among all wide receivers. He finished with 73 catches, 911 yards, and 10 touchdowns, and that was top 5 in fantasy points per game. It should be pointed out as well, T. Higgins and Chase played together. Higgins actually had a higher first read target share, which means he was drawing targets at a higher rate than Jamar Chase was. But with how poor the Bengals defense was last year and is going to be this year, this is going to be one of the more lucrative spots on a week-to-week basis because of, again, how consolidated the target share is. They don't really have an established wide receiver 3. They have a collective cast of Noah Fant, Mike Gesicki, tight end, and then you have Chase Brown catching passes out of the backfield. So this is the type of situation we want to target on a weekly basis. And this week, they do get a matchup against the Cleveland Browns out of the gate, who really struggle to stop opposing wide receivers as they allow the 10th most receiving yards and the 4th most touchdowns to the position, making T a very borderline top 12 wide receiver. I kind of went back and forth between him and Ladd McConkey, who have at that 12 spot. So love T. Higgins this week. Next up is going to be Tet McMillan. Listen, I'm extremely high on Tet this season, and I think he hits the ground running right out of the gate. And now his target competition is absolutely nothing. Adam Thielen was just traded, and then we got news on Saturday that Jaylen Coker was placed out of IR out of absolutely nowhere. Like there was no indication anywhere that this was coming. And so now I don't see really a scenario where he doesn't see under 8 targets in this game. Like it wouldn't shock me to see him get double-digit targets. And it really helps that he gets an incredible matchup in week 1, going up against the Jaguars, who have the 4th most PPR points at the wide receiver position. And I'm locking him into my lineups right out of the gate. I absolutely love this spot for Tet McMillan. I think he is a smash play this week. Next up is going to be Xavier Worthy versus the Chargers. And as we know, Rashee Rice got suspended for the first 6 games of the season. Now, Xavier Worthy was only the wide receiver 40 in fantasy points per game last year during his rookie season. He averaged 5.8 targets per game, and his 20% target per out run rate was 63rd. However, we know Andy Reid typically slow plays wide receiver early this season and starts to include them more as the season goes on. This is exactly what we saw with Worthy last season. While the overall numbers weren't great last year, he did finish as the wide receiver 22 from weeks 10 through 17. With another season under his belt, he's likely going to see an expanded role over these first 6 weeks of the season while Rashee Rice is out. There's been a big push this offseason. That's all they've really talked about is incorporating the deep ball back into this offense. And we saw it during the preseason. They took multiple shots. I think this is exactly what they're going to do. We obviously know that Xavier Worthy is a very solid deep ball wide receiver with his incredible 4.2 speed. And so I think Xavier Worthy is going to be on the receiving end of a lot of those targets. And I think they're also going to include him on a lot of short intermediate routes. Scheming him touches is what they're going to do. So I think there's a lot to like here in this matchup. And now let's not forget the Chargers last year allowed the 6th most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers. So I do think Worthy is a pretty strong wide receiver 2 this week. Next up, let's talk about one of my favorite wide receivers to target all offseason, and that's Ricky Pearsall versus Seattle. I have been the conductor of the Ricky Pearsall trade. While he wasn't overly impressive in his rookie season, everything is lined up for him to break out in a pretty big way. Let's talk about it. The wide receiver room is an absolute mess. Brandon Ayuk is on the PUP list, recovering from his injury last season. Juwan Jennings is still holding out, still has not practiced. It's looking highly unlikely that he plays week 1. Then you have Demarcus Robinson, who got suspended. Things are so bad, they brought in MVS and Sky Moore. And I can tell you, both of those dudes are terrible. And so right now, I just don't see a scenario where Ricky Pearsall doesn't demand 8 to 10 targets in this game. Yes, George Kittle is certainly going to be involved. Christian McCaffrey is certainly going to be involved in the passing game, but there's absolutely not anybody else to throw the ball to at this point at the wide receiver position outside of Ricky Pearsall. And not to mention, this is also a great matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, who allowed the 12th most PPR points to the position. And so Ricky Pearsall is an easy wide receiver 2 for me this week. Let's keep it moving. We're going to talk about somebody that I haven't talked about at all this offseason, and that's Marvin Harrison. There isn't a lot of excitement around him this season, and while he didn't produce at the same level as like a Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, or even Ladd McConkey, his rookie season wasn't necessarily terrible, hauling in 62 passes for 885 yards and 8 touchdowns, and finished with 11.6 fantasy points per game, which finished right outside the top 36. Now, obviously, he didn't meet expectation whatsoever for where he was drafted, and he wasn't efficient at all. I will say, though, his 68% catchable target rate was 64th among wide receivers last year. And so that didn't really help him out in the way they were utilizing him. There was a lot of deep targets and stuff like that to him. I felt like they could have done a better job of scheming him touches, getting him into the slot, having him be the big slot wide receiver. it just felt like a lot of times they just weren't on the same page, Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison. We'll see after a full offseason of them working together to see if we can get this going in the right direction, because I do think Marvin Harrison is better than what we saw last year. Maybe he's not the generational talent that everybody thought that he was going to be, but I still think in this offense he can be a solid producer. And this is a really good matchup, which is why I have him. Because if this would have been anybody else, I probably would have had him as a wide receiver 3. But they get a matchup against the Saints, who have allowed the 7th most PPR points to the position last year. So I do think Marvin Harrison has at least a solid wide receiver 2, back end wide receiver 2. So let's keep it moving here, and let's move over to the wide receiver 3s, and they are as follows: Jaylen Waddle, Courtland Sutton, Emeka Egbuka, Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Jerry Jeudy, Jameson Williams, Matthew Golden, Chris Olave, Travis Hunter, DK Metcalf, and Stephon Diggs. So let's talk about a few of these guys here. Jaylen Waddle versus the Colts. I went back and forth if I should make him a wide receiver 2 or 3 this week. I settled on a high-end wide receiver 3. Last season was an absolute disaster for Waddle, though. In 15 games, he had 58 catches for 744 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he was the wide receiver 50 in fantasy points per game. I think, though, there is a plenty of reasons to be optimistic as he will bounce back in a big way this year. While I think he's never been a prolific touchdown scorer, he has been a wide receiver 2 or better in 3 of the previous seasons that he played. And one area that really hurt Waddle last year was Jonnu Smith gobbling up a lot of the short and intermediate targets. Jonnu received 110 targets last year. And now the good news is, though, Jonnu Smith is gone. I think we see Waddle get back to being the guy he was in 2023, where he was top 10 in yards per out run, and he averaged 14 fantasy points per game. And if Tyreek Hill continues to decline, or just Tyreek Hill continues to do dumb stuff that he's been doing all offseason, there's definitely a scenario here where we get much closer to the 2022 version of Jaylen Waddle, where he had 75 catches for 1,300 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, and finishes the wide receiver 12 in fantasy points per game that year. So, and things do really set up nicely with this matchup against the Colts, as the Colts yielded the 11th most PPR points to the position last year. So I think with Jonnu gone, it really consolidates target back to just basically Waddle, Devon Achane, and Tyreek Hill. Being a good matchup, I think he's a very, very solid wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 3 for me this week. Next up, I really tried to get Emeka Egbuka inside my top 24. But basically everything I said about this game, you can copy and paste when it comes to Emeka Egbuka. I want pieces of this game. I think 6 to 8 targets is a very, very good number we could put him at for this game. And he's absolutely crushed camp. And with all the injuries, I just think he's going to be a huge part of this offense right out of the gate. Baker Mayfield has talked so much this offseason about how much he loves Egbuka, and we've seen it show up, in training camp and in preseason. So I'm firing him up everywhere I can. Next up is going to be George Pickens. Now, I also love George Pickens for the season as season-long output. I just don't think this is the best matchup to get right out of the gate. The Eagles' defense is incredible. They allow the 6th fewest PPR points to the position. And honestly, not a lot has changed with how good this defense is going to be this year. While I love George Pickens' season-long output, and there's going to be plenty of weeks where I have him as a top 20 wide receiver, I just don't think I'm going to do it for this week. I still think you're playing him. I think he could get loose for a long touchdown, but this is just not the best spot. I still think he's a viable low-end wide receiver 3. He's just not a high-end guy for me this week. Next up, let's keep it moving, and let's talk about Matthew Golden, wide receiver 32. Golden was drafted in the first round by the Packers. The Packers have been searching for a true wide receiver 1 since they moved on from Devontae Adams. They drafted Christian Watson in the second round, but he can't stay healthy. Then they drafted Jaden Reed, and after a promising rookie season, had a down year in 2024, and he's now dealing with a Jones fracture in his foot and is attempting to play through it. Any sort of foot injury for a wide receiver is a big concern and a red flag for me. But then they went and drafted Matthew Golden in the first round. The door is pretty much wide open for him to lead this team in targets this year. I think it's between him and Tucker Kraft for where that's going to come out. We do know that the Packers want to run a much more balanced offense than they did last year. They were much more run heavy last year. They only threw the ball at a 48% clip. And you compare that to 2023, where they threw the ball 57% of the time. So I do think they want to get back to being more of a little bit more pass heavy offense than they were last year. But either way, Matthew Golden is set up really, really well right out of the gate to receive a very heavy target share. And let's not forget, this is a phenomenal matchup against the Lions. The Lions last year allowed the 2nd most PPR points to wide receivers. So Matthew Golden is another top 36 wide receiver for me. And then next up is going to be DK Metcalf, wide receiver 35. This is a really bad matchup. This is a really bad matchup for DK Metcalf to make his debut in. This game has the lowest total of any game on the slate, with just 37 points. That's absolutely disgusting. And it's not really a spot I want to target any pass catchers for the Steelers. The Jets are a very good against wide receivers as well, allowing the fourth fewest PPR points last year. And only the Broncos allowed fewer touchdowns than wide receiver last season. I don't really want to get cute this week, but I wouldn't blame anyone if thinking about sitting Metcalf here. It's just not a good matchup whatsoever for DK Metcalf. So let's keep it moving. I just want to hit on a few guys that are going outside of the top 36. The first one for me is going to be Josh Downs. He's wide receiver 38 for me, but I really love this matchup, and I think he could shine here in a matchup with Daniel Jones at quarterback. Let's not forget, though, Downs last year was wide receiver 28 fantasy points per game. We know Daniel Jones is going to do whatever he can to not throw the ball deep. He is always looking to go short, intermediate, and this is really where Josh Downs shines, plays majority of his snaps from the slot. And so really like this spot here for Josh Downs. I think he was really close for me, getting him as a top 36 wide receiver. Next up, Christian Kirk, I think, is also a very viable flex option this week in a matchup against the Rams. We know the Texans will not be able to run the ball very effectively this season, which means we should see a lot of more passing offense in this new Nick Caley offense. The Rams last season allowed the 15th most PPR points to the position as well. So Christian Kirk, I think, is also a viable wide receiver 4. I think Adam Thielen also falls into that bucket with Jordan Addison being suspended. For the first 3 games, he steps into this role. I think Justin Jefferson's obviously going to lead this team in targets, but Adam Thielen, I think, could see somewhere in the range of 5 to 7, maybe score a touchdown. So I think he's sort of a viable option. And lastly, the other guy that's playing in this Bucs game and the Falcons game, and that's Darnell Mooney. I'm a big fan of Darnell Mooney. I was a big fan of him last year. I still don't think he got the respect he deserved. Now, he did miss a lot of camp and the preseason action because of an injury he suffered. Now, he did return to practice and looks like he's on track to play week 1. And as long as that is the case, again, consolidated target share, great game environment, great matchup. For most of the season last year, he was on pace with Drake London until he got hurt late in the year. And so I like Darnell Mooney. I think this is also a great matchup for him. And so Darnell Mooney's another player. If he plays, I have no problem throwing him into my flex in some deeper formats, deeper leagues. That being said, if you have any questions, start sit questions, trade questions, waiver questions, whatever it is, let us know in the comment section below. Let's get that W for week 1, and we'll be back here again. And don't forget, on Wednesday night, we will be going live to answer all of your start sit questions like we do every single Wednesday night. We'll see you on the next one.